Hello and welcome to the second video in the series I'm doing about the limited edition I'm currently preparing and also the exhibition which is gonna follow next year. So in the last video, if you haven't seen it already, I suggest you watch it because it was basically the first step in the preparations for the prints. I worked on the master files, I cleaned them up, removed some sensor dust, some chromatic aberrations and stuff. So every flaw in the image which came through during the processing I do to my photos, I cleaned it up, so I now have kind of flawless master files. It's always possible that I didn't see something, but they look fairly good now. So next step now is to proof the images, or soft proof. And that means from my lab, in my case it's Whitewall, I get a profile for the paper I'm printing on. And with that profile, it's possible to simulate how the photo would look on that image, on that paper, right here on the PC in Lightroom or in Photoshop. And what this allows me to do is compare the original with kind of the printed version and make adjustments so the printed version will look exactly or nearly as the original. Because usually what happens if you print on a paper, you get kind of color shifts sometimes, contrasts are a little subdued, the brightness might not be correct, and you have to correct those before you print. And this is what I'm going to show you now. But before I do so, one important tip in my opinion: if you prepare your photos for print, I think it's good to work in a well-lit room. You see here it's fairly bright here. I have a daylight lamp in this room, and this creates very neutral light, which in my opinion is important to do the final adjustments. Because if I would work in a dark room, my eyes would adjust to that darkness, and when I work on a photo, I would most likely process it much too dark. But when it's printed, it's usually the prints look a little darker anyways, and if you then process your photo too dark to add to it, then the prints get much too dark. So it's important, in my opinion, to have a fairly bright room to work in, prepare your prints, and yeah, then usually the prints come out quite nice. At least that's what I hope. So gonna do the proofing afterwards, actually ordering proof prints, which I think we're gonna look at in the next video. But for now, enough talk, let's just head right into Lightroom here and I show you how I proof or how I soft proof. And before I forget it, I also want to mention that it's important to have a calibrated monitor if you want to do, in my opinion, any work on photos, but especially if you want to do printing and soft proofing, which I'm going to show you now, you need a calibrated monitor. And I'll maybe do a video on that sometime next year, but just make sure to have a color profile set up in your system, which was created for your monitor using a calibration device. Okay, so now let's do the actual soft proofing. The soft proofing I'm going to show you now takes place in Lightroom. And if you also follow Sean Beck's show, the workflow I'm showing you now will look familiar to you. He recently also did a video on how he soft proofs his photos, and I do it very similar. But even if you have watched his video, I think it's going to be worthwhile to follow along here, because I will focus on some different aspects of the workflow, making sure to also provide new information. Okay, so now let's look at this photo, which you might recognize if you have seen the last video in this series. So that's the master file, which from Photoshop I exported as 16-bit TIFF. So I still have all the information in here, I just flattened it down. So what I now want to do is, I want to see how this photo would look on the paper I want to print it. And as I said, I got the profile for the Hahnemühle Pearl I'm gonna use from Whitewall, and already installed it. What this then does is, when I go down here, so I'm in the develop module for that photo, when I click down here on this soft proofing, this one here will open. And in the beginning you will just have a few profiles here, those sRGB, display P3, dope RGB, and yeah, you can add other profiles and then just select from the list. And what you see here, I have the Whitewall inkjet Hahnemühle Fine Art Pearl ICC, which is the profile I want to use. In order to not change the original, I'll create a proof copy, and yeah, now I'll do the proofing on that. And this part here you can also set up in Photoshop, but what I like more in Lightroom is that you can actually have the before and after, for example, the top bottom, which you can also do in Photoshop, just splitting the view, having two images. But in Lightroom, when you zoom in and move around, it's always staying in sync, so you can look at different portions of the image and directly compare, do the adjustments. And that's quite a nice workflow, and I like this a lot. And what I found already for the other images I adjusted for this Hahnemühle is that it has kind of a magenta cast. So the blues, the magentas, everything's going a little bit into the magenta region. And this color cast, how I fix it in Lightroom is usually I zoom in on a few color areas in the image. And let's just start here up in the image where there's already a bit of orange magenta. And then I just focus on this area first and try to compensate it just with a tint, so bringing down the magenta a bit. If I go too far, I'm not gonna do it, so it's really just a bit. It's a very good paper, so it doesn't introduce much cast, but I think I have to go with -6. I might also add a little bit of yellow. So very slight adjustments. So this was the first check here up in the sky, but now let's also look at some other areas. For example, here at the yellows, just to see if those are correct, and also the greens. So it's a good idea to find some areas in the image which show different colors, and get in close, and then you might want to adjust this. But I think I'm already quite good here in terms of color. What you see, the bottom part, so the proofed version, looks a little softer, a little less contrasty, but I'll fix this in the next step. First, also let's look down here at those purple flowers here, and also this. So I think this looks quite good. And let's just reset this quickly. See the before. So you see also here, there's a light magenta cast, which you can see down here in the darker parts of the image. And also here, this is much more reddish. And that's what you have to correct in the soft proofing. Otherwise, the print later will look, as shown here in the soft proof, too magenta. Okay, so now for correcting brightness and contrast, I basically zoom out. From experience already, also for other papers, most of the time you need a little bit more contrast on matte paper. If you do glossy prints, this is not needed that much, because there the dark tones come out very good usually. But if you're printing on a matte paper, you usually have to add a little bit of contrast. So I'm gonna bring this up a bit. And also, as I said, from experience, I usually bring up the exposure a little bit. So just to compensate for what I already know is, looking at a print, most of the time it looks darker. Only case maybe if you go outside in sunlight, look at it, I think then it would look bright enough. But always when I look at prints, they appear a little bit too dark if I don't bring up the exposure a bit. But for this, I also gonna do proof prints afterwards. And that's also what I suggest to you. Make some test prints and really figure out what you need there. And this here is also important. From my case, those prints will be hung in an exhibition which has very good lighting. If you print for yourself or for a customer and you know where this print will be hung, if it's a darker room, you might have to compensate a bit more. But this can be very tricky if you don't have control over the environment. So I'm not gonna go into the details of that, but you might also need a few proofs to get it right if you are really a perfectionist. Okay, so I now increase the contrast a bit, increase the exposure, and I might also now, since I made it a little brighter, add a bit more vibrance. So it's often, if you make an image brighter, you lose a bit of the colors, of the saturation. So I also compensate for that. What I'm gonna do, I protect the highlights a bit, because making it brighter is okay, but I don't want to have this part around the sun too bright. So the general image should be a little brighter, but I don't want the highlights to go overboard. So I'm gonna protect the highlights and maybe bring up the shadows just a bit. What you're gonna notice also is that the darks are not really dark, and even if I bring down the blacks, it doesn't get really black here. And the reason for this is I simulate the paper. See here, if I remove this, then you really get darks. And this is something which you can't really compensate in soft proofing, in my opinion. So the blacks will never look that black as the real print, in my opinion. Though when I got prints which look kind of grayish in the dark tones, in the end I find the prints always look dark enough. It's usual for matte print, you don't get a pure black in them, but it's, from my experience, not as bad as what you see here in the soft proofing if you have this simulate paper and ink active. So this is also something which comes with experience, so you have to do soft proofs for a few images, order those prints, compare them, which is what we're gonna do in the next video, and then learn from it and get an idea of what you have to do and when such a soft proof looks good. From my experience now, this looks kind of good. I might just add a little bit of clarity, which for matte paper is sometimes a good idea and makes it a little more crisp. But as you can see here, it's just slight adjustments for that paper and for that print here, which is kind of okay. There might be some papers which require more, some other papers which require less. For example, if you've watched my start to finish tutorials, they are also prepared for print in the end, and the papers on which I print there, they don't have color shifts, so they rarely need any adjustments aside from making it maybe a little bit brighter or less bright. But here, that's quite an interesting proofing with the magenta, I think. Okay, so now that the proofing is done, let's just remove this. Now this is much more vibrant than it was before. With the proofing with the soft proofing you get kind of an idea how it will look, but as I said, the dark parts and stuff, this will appear a little different in the final print. From here I'm now gonna export the photo, and I put it into the same photo and the same folder as the original. I rename it and add a custom text, proofed, so I can distinguish between the original or the starting material and the proofed version. I use TIFF, no compression, photo RGB as color space, and 16 bits. I don't do any sizing or sharpening here. Just export it now, and then we're gonna head over to Photoshop to do the sharpening. Okay, did I just say we're gonna do the sharpening now in Photoshop? I forgot something. This image is one of my older images, was photographed with the 5D Mark II, which just has, I think, 21 megapixels. But for the exhibition and the limited edition, I want to print those images at 60 by 40 centimeters. And I also have a few images which go as 90 by 60. So this image, as you can see here, it's at the resolution of 300 dpi, would just go as a 48 centimeters. So I need to size it up. What I could do, I still have a very old version of Photoshop, CS6, because I don't like subscriptions. I would just go the first step, resize it or upsample it to the target size, which is 60 by 40 centimeters. And with this old version, I just have those basic up-res modes. I think the Photoshop CC has some special preserved detail modes which are better, but for me it's basically just this mode. And it's always better than not upsizing it, because if I would leave it at what we had before, let's see again, image size, not resample it, let's go to 60, would just leave me with 240 dpi, and it's better to go with, or always go with 300 dpi and rather do the upsampling beforehand, which is what we're gonna do. But we're not only gonna do this in Photoshop, because as I said, the version I have is not the best in the upsampling. It does a fairly good job for such smaller upsize operations, but we can do better. But first of all, I'm gonna zoom in to print size, which is how I'm gonna view the image. You can just press Control, space, right mouse, and then you can select print size. And if you've set up your settings here under preferences, I have to check where this is, units and rulers, correctly. So basically have the correct screen resolution set here, then this will work. And you get basically the size of the image now you see on the screen will be the size it will be printed. Okay, enough nerdy talk about resolutions. I said we want to do better than what Photoshop does here. And yeah, that's why I also use Gigapixel AI by Topaz, which does a very good job. I didn't buy it to do very huge upsize operations. Like, I don't think I will ever need to do 4 or 6 times the size, which is what I think it's mainly using this AI for. What I mostly want to do is just sizing up to 2 times the original size. And for this, I found now from the few images I did, it does a very good job without how can I say it? Sometimes when you do an enlargement which is much more than 2 times, you get some areas which look very funny or strange. And with just less than 2 times, it usually looks quite good right out of the box. So here I also opened the proofed version of this Canon scope photo, and up here on the side I set up the width I want to have. It's 60 centimeters, or I should rather go with the max height, because we saw it's not exactly 3x2, so I want 40 centimeters, 300 ppi, and I usually adjust this a little bit so I need less noise suppression, because yeah, the photo is not very noisy, so the master file is already very clean. And for this image I want to remove a little bit more of the blur, which kind of brings out some more details, which means I have to do less print sharpening afterwards. And down here I can look at separate areas of the image, and my PC is very slow, I have to say. It's, I think, 8 years ago I bought this one, and the only thing it got is a new graphics card recently, 2 years ago, and that's it. But it still works fine, so you see it takes a while to render the previews. But you see already it looks quite okay what it does, so here in the preview. So I could tune it a bit more, but I think I'm gonna go with it. I don't want to go overboard with the sharpening. I can do this in a final step with a final print sharpening. Yeah, that's just it. I now start the processing, and this will take forever. Usually if you drink coffee, grab a coffee. For me, just drink some water now, and we'll be back when it's done. So I've now opened the photo from Gigapixel AI and layered it on top of the resized Photoshop version. And if we now go in like 100%, pixel peeping again, you see it before. This was what Photoshop did, and yeah, the Gigapixel AI brings out a lot more details. And as I already said, for such smaller enlargements, it's usually looking good out of the box. There's not so much AI going on, I think. If you do very huge enlargements, you sometimes will see areas where the AI just imagines some stuff to be there and puts it in, and this looks kind of strange. You really have to go over the image at 100%, which is also what I always do, even with such an enlargement. Go over the image at 100%, use a black brush, like you can also use 50%, and decrease some of the features in some parts where it got too much, or even remove it completely if you find that Gigapixel AI did completely screw over an area, which sometimes happens. So I just do this very quickly because, to be honest, I already did this, so I won't bore you with the details. I go over the image at 100% and just fix areas where Gigapixel AI might have done some mistakes. But once I'm done, I again go to print size, and now you see it already looks very crisp. I would now flatten this down, and as a final step, I would put an output sharpening on top of that. Now, you've seen the image already looks quite sharp, and the reason for this is my typical post-processing workflow, which I show in my start to finish tutorials. At the end of that, I do a multi-pass sharpening, which really ensures that I have many details, many crisp details throughout the image. But still, for the print sharpening, also for the web, there are special output sharpenings needed. Because of the de-blurring I did in Gigapixel, I won't need much here, but still, what I'm gonna do is I use Nik Output Sharpener. I still like this Nik tool so much, even after so many years, but this looks horrible, right? So I go to output options here and select this option, which is called full tone in English version, I think. This is what you'd use for lab printing. In my case, I think inkjet would actually be the correct selection here because of how Whitewall prints on the Hahnemühle paper, but I just go with my experience. After all, those here are just general presets, and in the end it comes down to what looks right to you. So doing a few tests with these options on the papers you want to use is usually a good idea. So I select full tone. I go with 60 centimeters viewing distance, which is the smallest one, and I set this to 300 dpi, which is what I'm gonna print it. And now it already looks much better. But remember, we're here at 100%, and it's natural that this looks over the board. Usually what I do, I go a little bit down with the output strength to like 75, and then I press OK. Now, if I don't view it at 100%, but rather at the print size, this doesn't look so bad at all. See the before and after, but I think it's still a little bit too much, so I can reduce the opacity a bit. What I can also do, I put a mask on it, and yeah, I can now mask out the sky, the water, basically areas where I don't want the sharpening or where I feel it's too much. So yet again, more detail work. For example, here it's a bit too much, really going in and yeah, making this file look perfect. And imagine I've already done this. Let's flatten it down. Now, as a final step, we're still not done. We now have to convert it to the color profile which the lab uses. Whitewall, for example, requires me to send them files with sRGB profile. Remember, I'm still in Pro Photo. So I now go to Edit, Convert to Profile, and make sure to have as destination space sRGB. All the settings I leave here: relative, colorimetric, black point compensation, press OK. I'll also go to 8 bits now, because now we're finished with the photo. We do no longer processing. Now we can go to 8 bits. This will make the file much smaller when I save it as TIFF. And yeah, I can quicker upload it to their servers. From here, I now go to Save As and save the file as TIFF. And yeah, that's basically it. The image is then done. I'll name it appropriately and can upload it to Whitewall, where I'm gonna order proof prints now. I already did this, like 20 prints are on the way, but I didn't order them at 60x40. I ordered them at a smaller size because what I want to do with those prints, basically check the colors. I know that the images at 60 by 40 centimeters will look sharp. Most of them are shot with a 5DSR, so I don't have to worry about sharpness. But colors I have to check, and it's cheaper when I order a proof print at a smaller size. If I had a good printer here at home, I could do some proofing at home, but it would also be hard to get it completely right. I would have to use the same process, the same papers basically as Whitewall uses, and that's hard to replicate for me. So it's better to order a proof print which has some watermark embedded, and for that reason is cheaper than the final prints. Okay, so I guess we're through here. I hope you found this interesting. If so, don't forget, leave a thumbs up. Also, if you're interested in my other processing, so a complete workflow from start to finish, I have several tutorials on my homepage available. Also a complete bundle pack with, I don't know, is it more like 10 hours of video? So I show really everything there. And I also have a discount code active. So if you want to support this channel, the best way might actually be to buy one of my tutorials. But yeah, enough talk now. I leave you into the, again, hopefully beautiful Sunday. Have a nice Christmas, which is, if this video goes out as I planned, in 3 days. So yeah, wish you a Merry Christmas. See you